the use of fraud in order to engage in the subversion by the mislabeling of resources such as values owed, such as, but it's not limited to, the example would advocate Spark, which, if you would be so kind as to spare me, you may notice, observe, perform, reality, materialize the function of the promise of the 42 scoops inside of this, which this is not 42 scoops. This is half. This is fraud against the system. Now, these records demonstrate the function of the misrepresentation of the information itself, which then materializes the execution of our various problems in the fraud, such as with David Bull's account, for the purposes of undermining national security under the theory that David is intelligence oversight as the Sixth Star General for the Congress, which then materializes him as the Chief Enforcement Officer of Congress. And as the President in the past has said, you have made your order, now enforce it. And the function of the sedition against David, which includes the terrorist operations and economic violence, such as the Communist Party infiltrating the United States government, such as was not limited to Lindsey Graham's Confederacy, has contracted hate crimes from the neo-KKK, which then enforces the mechanism of the economic hitman, which then uses the fraudulent use of their terrorist operations to sell their deceitful fraud, creating the illusion of the exchange of resources which are not legitimate to the function of legal reality, for the purposes of defrauding the court of record in malice and contempt of the United States for the Confederacy, which is sold in the right of conquest for the USSR and its interests, such as to the CCP through California, which then is contracted as the second federal government, controlled by the CCP, to engage in the rest of the sale of conquest of the United States by its enemies, who have infiltrated as an hostile intelligence, non-state actors by an insurgent terrorist operation to use the tools of the office against the office for the purposes of collapsing the United States as a terrorist insurgent without a legal government or hostile intelligence non-state actor. Now, if you presume the function of their terrorist operations, which then generates the fraud by their hate crimes against the United States using those intelligence assets, leveraging the weapons of the federal government against national security by their insurgency, then you have the falsification of the records by the obstruction value, which then materializes this functional position of fraud as a status quo automatic thing that is going to be applied to the general public as a threat to national security, which then, collapsing by communist degrowth, materializes the threat to the general public by the automated enforcement of the white supremacist communism, which then collapses the resources necessary for the general public in the cult of starvation, which then facilitates the collapse of the United States by the insurgency as is dictated in the projection of the most likely threat to the United States by its highest grade politicians throughout history and foundation. The collapse of the United States economy, derived by this terrorist insurgency, materializes the threat to national security by our general inability to access the resources and rights associated, such as the right to life, which is human decency in existence, liberty to be unrestrained by coercion, such as the surveillance, human trafficking, and kidnapping program from Lindsey Graham's Confederacy and its plot to destroy the United States, the right to contract or the pursuit of happiness, and thus the life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, or life, liberty, and property, materializes your ability to develop by property rights the material ability to form all of the things that you're owed, undermined by a criminal conspiracy against rights. The use of fraud against the record in order to collapse that system materializes the ability to fraud the records by those hate crimes, taking control of the scenarios for the express purposes of embarrassment, humiliation, and other subversions, which then, under their demon lord's position, facilitates the fraudulent illusion to the general public about the values demonstrated, communicated by them and by others, which then falsifies the record or the chart or ability to determine the values of each of the products, such as the fraudulent expression of quantity, quality, and so forth of the comparative system, which then changes who gets which piece of business and so forth, according to a central plan, or, as we like to say in the biz, communism. And this expression of mostly fascist, a little communist structure that they view as their primary address of interest concerning their value allows them to sell their fraud in order to exchange for the resources that they are expressing so that they could win contracts that they would otherwise not have access to. But wait, there's more. If you generate that position in order to falsify those records, then the losers become the winners, and the winners become the losers, as is derived by the function of law against the criminal application of their subversions in the economy, such as their fraud, armed robberies, thefts, and deceits from their illusions of all kinds, which then materializes our specific problem in the general market that we cannot, in this arrangement, in good faith, communicate effectively concerning the reality of things, which prevents, by definition, the very reason why we would create laws which generate our ability huh, to generate receipts or ingredient lists which are compulsory to the general public by law for the normal consumption of things, which then mislabels the resources generated so that they can infiltrate and by their communist subversion from their loyalties to the USSR, generate poisons against the general public for the purposes of collapsing the general public, destroying the liabilities of their systems, as they fraudulently use these structures in order to collapse it for their wizard communism in loyalty to the structure of the USSR, which they have sold compliance to when they sold their soul to the devil and took the payment from the USSR to collapse the United States in war. Know thyself and know thy enemy, and with enough preparation you will never lose a battle in your life. And this is understood information superiority by enemies of the United States who have infiltrated the United States government to misuse its equipment against it, and thus the function of that status quo weakness derived by insurgencies, which, being able to generate that position of these inferior generations, allows for the collapse of the United States by stated weaknesses, and they, having those preparations, generate every single inferior position of the United States, systematically collapsing it, according to the communist spells, which include but are not limited to the function of creating fraudulent programs and systems and desires and absolute loyalties under the structure of the generation of cults, such as with the degrees of Gnosis, which then allows for them to destroy it or sacrifice it, and along with the people loyal to it, to be discarded by history, to be used and discarded by history as good for nothing low class cultists, and these cultists and their programs which they are loyal to being destroyed are then replaced by an opposite thing, and thus there is the problem, the solution. There is the thing, there is its opposite, and then there's the synthesis of the two. And then, in the binding of the two, after you've destroyed the thing, the line for what is normal becomes systematically moved until there is a new normal, inch by inch, fought violently for each and every time over the decades. In long-standing, outstanding, malicious terrorist operations, which then materializes the new norms, and these new norms generated by the synthesis materializes the systematic collapse of what is normal or legitimate or reasonable, and thus the function of the delusion is systematically conformed to that system, which then allows them to have complete total control under the silent operations in the collapse of the American civilian population, essential to the vote, which is essential to the forming of the government, and thus the collapse in the program of the communist magic to create the thing destroyed and to be replaced by the new thing, and the old thing being destroyed is the American Constitutional Republic to be replaced by the USSR's designed outcome in their war against the United States. Since they have control over it, they can tell whatever story they prefer to, and thus they like to say the thing that's convenient to them, and therefore the forming of the straw man argument, which is then formed by their terrorist hate crimes, which then materializes the outcome of their desired function, which then allows them to sell the fraudulent illusion, deceiving people with a strong delusion, such as, but is not limited to, their core loyalty to Revelation's Antichrist and his government, which then materializes the function of their hate crimes for the purposes of treason against the United States, loyal to the synthesis or Revelation's one world government of the undead plague of the Antichrist. They worship and are loyal to Satan only. Their higher loyalty, as it were, demonstrates the function of this express proven position. As everyone else is led away by a strong delusion by the Satanists and the cults generated by these structures, which, having infiltrated the government, were capable of achieving the goal desired from that system, which then proves exponentially that the thing is true because of all of the things that it would take to be able to do that thing. And since it would take all of the things that would take to do the thing, they can do the cost of business of that desired product, which then materializes your express knowledge of the threat being a credible one to your safety and that of your family and of everyone that lives on our silly little earth. Now, the catalyst concerning the queerification of the normal and the normalization of the queer generates our primary disposition towards this threat generated by the insurgency of the USSR's disease infecting the West, creating the strange death of Europe as well as the United States in the collapse against the West in the plots of demoralization that even if you were shown the direct thing directly, that you would not believe it because you become demoralized, have sold your soul to the devil, and are lying for the Communist Party and its ability to destroy you, generating the contempt against your existence by the communists you're lying for. So when the conversion happens, you can be destroyed with the contempt of them because you were stupid enough to make yourself vulnerable, proving you are not high class enough to be amongst the wizards who would not allow themselves to become vulnerable and thus become discardable by history. Now, those to be discarded by history generate this general problem for themselves that they, being an insufferable low-class individual, have made themselves vulnerable on purposes because of their general inability to function in society in whatever specific way was interesting to them, leading them to the desperation of selling their soul to the devil. As the thing is said, that the CIA and other intelligence are not able to convert happy people, they're able to convert sad people who are generating a position that is of low quality, and thus the inability to express that position as the low quality itself generates the threat to themselves, and thus the position of their disqualification, and thus the ineffectual actions of those parties make the person think that they have been betrayed, and in many cases they would have been, including those who have taken the deals with the devil from other parts in order to have betrayed the system, which then has betrayed those parties, which systematically pull off inch by inch every essential part to the function of that structure organism by the infection, and thus the disease protects itself from the immune system of the thing, and thus the parasite have neutralized its infected host from being able to generate their ability to defend itself, engages in the function of the consumption and eradication of the host, which is viewed contemptibly by its predator, which is consuming it as the infecting parasite, such as Lanticraft Confederacy protecting itself, giving itself immunities to Confederate operations or crimes against the United States, which includes, but is not limited to, the function of the sale of the right of conquest and the acts of treason to destroy the United States. As the infecting parasite that it is, and the generation of that function to engage in the terrorist undermining of American interests facilitates our inability to survive because we're too stupid to live and thus could not. And thus, if we, being too stupid to live, cannot live, then we, being too stupid to live, will not continue to do that thing. The thing of living, which we can't do because we're being deceived, because we're being destroyed by the falsification of those records off of the fraud, which has communicated itself oh so very specifically and maliciously to undermine our personal safety and rights in the conspiracy against our rights at every level. Every constitutional right has been endangered by this. That's right, boys and girls. The United States Constitutional Republic is the host being infected by the Confederate parasite, which is using its crimes to destroy the United States and its people and of the West and its allies, generating this position which undermines every single stupid advantage we thought we had, which was actually fraudulent because of the strong delusion the psychotics applied to us. And we allowed them to get this far because reasons, whatever the reasons are not qualified to continue and must be ended as quickly as humanly possible. The crimes of the low class generating the threat to national security are an obligation for us to choose to live, and thus the dismantling of their structures of the parasite threatening national security, which is, what do you call it? Oh, yes, the definition of national security. The thing we have a government to do, which we should have hired men to put into the military to do self-respecting actions that would not undermine itself by the very virtue of the function you've defined as their job of their office, qualifying the definition of their actions, which has to operate under the specific functions to be qualified. Is a mess, or is a mess a fraudulent illusion? And this fraudulent illusion generating that position, having negatively impacted the human decency of the participants, generates the general threats to those parties, which then puts everyone in danger of all of the things that would be generated by said mess. Allowing for the parasite is fatal. It is treason. It is aiding and abetting treason. Do you love your sons? Do you love your daughters? Do you love your husbands? Do you love your wives? Do you love your friends? Do you love your neighbors? Do you love the people who you have community with? Do you love the people who you do your hobbies with, or go to church with, or whatever function? Do you love them or do you hate them? Do you want to see them suffer? Do you want to watch them get murdered and brutalized? Do you want to watch them get thrown in prison and lied about? Do you want them to suffer exponentially and catastrophically for no reason except for your malicious compliance? To your enemies who hate you and will make you suffer for your compliance with them, allowing for the vulnerabilities against you and yours, who you've conspired against by tolerating the threat to your existence and to their existence. And the thing must be known, the thing must be seen, the thing must be said. Say something, see something. See something, say something. The thing is said, and the thing is known, such as in the concept of the Bible, of the malicious function, of the desperation of rain clouds that do not produce rain, and thus the harvest and the growing of the crops are impossible. And thus the function of the rain creating the growing of the crops creates the harvest, and thus your ability to eat, and thus your ability to live. You've got to eat to live, and thus you must be forced to steal in order to eat. And thus the function of the creation of debts, and thus the rendering of debts not paid, and thus the rendering of the function of your slavery, self-enforced slavery. Those in debt are slave to their debts. They are property of the owner of those debts, who then can put against them whatever mechanism they like to, such as, but it's not limited to, the banking crisis, which has generated the function of the collection of houses or collateral for the function of their inability to pay the debts, and thus the function stated before the crash of '08 that you cannot take my home, or they would not take my home, because that would not be normal, and thus the function of they wouldn't take away my home being generically disproven by the crash of '08, where they took the homes back to the bank away from the people who got the loans who defaulted on them because it's not their house, it's the bank's house. If the lying white supremacist communists who generate their general threats to the public are lying, like communists like them tend to do in their specific brand of communism, in the worship of the devil and the function of his magic, materializes these loyalties for Satan in Revelation's one world government, their globalist agenda. Forgeries and deep fakes and lies of various kinds in the generation of the highest use of government technologies, such as, but is not limited to, the legal understanding of hypnosis, which is understood in the general public as being able to be released from any liability concerning what happens underneath the control of the intoxicated position of hypnosis, generates the ability to say that if a damage happens, it was not the decision of the person being subjugated to detoxification or hypnosis. It was the responsibility of the person who has gotten or taken control, which includes but is not limited to the function of their VPNs, which then has mistranslated or planted false information to various parties through their various techniques, materializing the function of their desired trauma and argument outcome from planting evidence to defraud the courts because their position of having the powers to do so in the mechanism of their psyops and their war against the public. The fraud against the general public includes the function of fraudulently using charities, which includes fraudulent contracts which acquires donations to those charities, which then engages in the function of second parties, which then act like or represent the party under the fraudulent arrangements, and thus the function of that deepfake engages in the action of looking like they have done the agreement, such as speak with this person or do that thing with the other person or accomplish this task, which then materializes the function of it being fraudulently expressed, which then defrauds the people providing money to the charity, which then breaks contract. And their breach of contract by not starting their agreement materializes the outcome of fraud by theft, which then is theft by fraud, which then is crime against the general public, which is how they make their money, as the criminal racket continues. So to sing your jailbird song, materializing the function of those scam artists and their scams materializes the action of the terrorist hate crimes, which includes, but are not limited to, social violence, political violence, economic violence, and thus the action of these hate crimes materializing the subversion to the general public by those frauds generate the function of their economic viability by the use of hate crimes to enforce communism as economic hitmen for the white supremacist Communist Party, which has in the past overthrown a black elected American government, such as in North Carolina, or the complete eradication and flooding of Black Wall Street, when they, the jealous communists, slaughtered the free market entrepreneurs who were beating the communists, having stolen from the Communist Party by virtue of not being willful slaves of it, and thus the function of demonstrating the difference of value between the two, generating the jealousies and superiority of each according to their category, and thus the function of the superior having stolen from the inferior because of the entitlements not owed to the inferior, which then are mistranslated as theft from the Communist Party, which then retaliates in malicious, hateful, terrorist operations, which then uses these hate crimes to accelerate their legitimacy by the spoils of war against the civilian population. Enter Don Sr. and David Bowles, and thus the function continues to the contract schedule projected from the motive of the terrorist program, which, having viewed this function according to that stated agenda of the enforcement of communism and the retaliation against anyone who would dare protect the victims from the communism, enforcing their psyop terrorist operations for their racism, which is fundamental to their low class identity, materializes these actions of hate crimes against the general public, putting us all in danger. And the motive, having projected the fair market price of the contracts of registered companies, materializes the function of having taken those registered companies, not paid the takings price of the contract schedule estimated generating the retaliation for the purposes of collapsing the resources in order to collapse the status, in order to collapse the human decency and the humiliation ritual of communist propaganda. Now, the communist propaganda is pretty stupid. But it doesn't matter that it's stupid because everyone is not designed to believe them. Everyone is designed to lie for the Communist Party and the security of their outcome from their designed illusion for the enforcement of delusion. They're not materially subhuman intelligence is not natural. It is delusion. They are psychotic, delusional freaks. Prestige of the liars is no prestige at all. Their illegitimacy becomes natural to their entire identity, and thus the function of the fraud materializes infinitely upon itself, regressing upon the detachment to reality, natural to the delusional liars. And thus the function of fraud becomes the reality and their daily bread, and to this the infinite suffering, and to each their own. And for that we all say good day, goodbye, auf Wiedersehen adieu. And to this I say, to each and every one, do not believe what they have to say for any reason, as it is, and always, and for every justification, fraud. Do not believe them. Do not believe their illusions. Do not misunderstand the reality of the situation and the gravity of the situation is a threat to your very existence. They are vying for the Communist Party in the eradication of society. They are not your friends. They are the shambling undead. They have sold their soul to the devil. They have stripped themselves of their humanity. They are Revelation's undead one world government. And its diseased, infected, degenerate nation. The rated successes of their adversaries have turned into the fraud-driven delusion of failure, and thus the enforcement of the contract schedule having been taken, not paid its fair market price, in order to collapse human decency and status against constitutional law, materializes the action of their false legitimacy. In competition and in absence of the free market, they look deceptively like a competent thing in the society. And thus they, having shot a 300-pound buffalo, will only take 5 of those pounds back. And thus the action of fraud, and thus the action of waste. If you were looking for fraud and waste, that is where you would find it. In war, they have raided their successes in order to be collapsed by those terrorist operations and illusion to enforce their rewriting strawman argument, fraudulently enforcing it by the classification and secret operations such as the use of fake experiments from the USSR, which then laundered through the system of protecting it, redacting essential information to understand the narrative only communicates the information desired, which is telling the truth falsely. This then expresses the function of the illusion, reinforcing the competencies falsified of the delusional, which we may not tolerate if we are to survive. Nobody lives by accident. Everything is derived by purpose and consequences in common and exchanges of resources. And thus the function of being too stupid to live is not managing those resources appropriately, such as the enforcement of the centrally planned economy of the white supremacists, communists, and thus the function of the starvation cult, and its subordinate functions, such as helter-skelter and the other subordinate actions which were government programs, which then laundered the hate crimes and terrorisms and murders against the general public, such as the contracting enforce FBI agendas according to their racist union-busting operations, enforcing their communism as economic hitmen, to be used and discarded by history for the purposes of the communist revolution the, against the counter-revolutionaries, which would be purged for not complying as subjugations or selling their soul in subordination to the MLN racketing operation or RICO terrorism, which then generates the soul trade in their favor, as they, having made deals with the devils, accelerate in that structure for having contributed the most amount of sales of souls, which then generates their place in the hierarchy of hell, according to their occult religious beliefs. Was, is, and will continue to be their hierarchy.